Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Amina, and I will be your host for today's session, presented in concert with our partner, BOMA Canada. We're very proud to be working with BOMA to host today's discussion on EV charging in the commercial real estate industry. First, I would like to take a moment to thank everyone for joining us today. I'm looking at the roster. It's moving 86, 87. So we're thrilled to see such a big turnout. Today's session is recorded for future use, and it will be available on our YouTube channel in the upcoming weeks. Finally, although our attendees are muted to prevent interruptions, please don't hesitate to use the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to answer some of these questions at the end of the webinar, time permitting. Now, let the fun begin, I guess. I think we can all agree that the public sector investment in EV charging infrastructure is instrumental in accelerating EV adoption. Private investment in EV charging will be required for the development of a robust and reliable public charging network that is ready to serve the needs of future EV drivers. Commercial real estate organizations are positioned to assist in the deployment of charging infrastructure, and in doing so could provide a value-added amenity to visitors while working to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. With us today to discuss this topic are very esteemed guests, and before proceeding with our discussion, I'm going to give them a chance to introduce themselves and their organizations. Shall we start with Hazel?
Sure. Thank you so much, Amina. Thank you for having me and for having us and for hosting this discussion, which I think is very pertinent and very well-timed with the government announcements that came recently. So my name is Hazel Sutton. I'm the Director of Environmental Standards with BOMA Canada. I've been with BOMA Canada for the last 8 years, and I lead the development of the technical content for our green building certification program for existing buildings called BOMA Best. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Hazel. Carey, please.
Perfect. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion, as well as the welcome distraction from the American election ongoing right now. My name is Carey Stein, and I'm the Senior Manager of Business Delivery within the National Operations Group here at Cadillac Fairview. For those of you that don't know, Cadillac Fairview, we're one of the largest owners and operators and developers of best-in-class office, retail, and mixed-use properties in North America. We're owned by the Ontario Teachers Pension Fund. And beyond Canada, we have real estate investments in the United States, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and most recently the UK. We have 69 properties across Canada and about 35 million in leasable space. And in my current role, I'm responsible for the continuous improvement of some of our key business programs and processes within the national operations team, working with our properties to ensure enterprise-wide programs meet and sustain their objectives. And that includes our National Electric Vehicle Charging Program as well.
Thank you, Carey. Welcome. Dan, over to you.
Thank you, Amina. Hello, everyone. My name is Dan Higginson. I'm the Innovation Specialist at Fortis BC. I'm located over in Kelowna, BC. Not sure how many West Coasters we have on the call today. For those of you that don't know, Fortis BC is a gas and electric utility in British Columbia. And if you're familiar with the geography of BC, the gas utility services most of the provinces, whereas the electric utility has a smaller portion in the interior of BC, which includes the Kootenays and the Okanagan, where I live. Prior to working at Fortis, I spent a number of years in the engineering consulting world, working on building envelope assessments, renewable energy, mostly geo-exchange and district energy, as well as some civil infrastructure projects. However, I knew that I wanted to be in the sphere of EVs, so 4 years ago I purchased an old Nissan Leaf, landed a job at Fortis, and ever since I've been weaseling my way to work on more and more EV projects at Fortis BC, to the point where today that's pretty much all I do. So I'm very honored to be here and excited to be talking to everybody about EVs.
I think the excitement is mutual. Thank you to the three of you for taking the time to share your piece of wisdom with us, considering that you all have a different perspective on what we're going to discuss today. So let's jump in. Our first question is for Dan and Carey. Would you mind detailing your charging deployment for us? How many stations, of what kind of strategic decisions were you forced to make in laying out your deployment, and what sort of priorities come into play when, as a utility or a commercial real estate vendor, Carey, you have to make decisions regarding procurement?
Sure, I can go first with that. So historically, the decision to deploy EV chargers at our sites was made very locally. So a general manager, a property manager would see a need, they'd investigate what was available in the market, and they'd understand the different business terms and what was available, and ultimately they decide what worked best for their site. More often than not, these were not great deals for CF. We were left paying the cost to purchase the charger, all the CapEx, the OpEx that came with it. And these were typically dummy chargers that really didn't provide us with a lot of analytics or understanding on usage. Oddly enough, the only case where we had a smart charger was actually a general manager out of Quebec that did do a deal with FLO directly. So our first and only smart charger in the field at the time was with FLO. And beyond basic sub-metering for total consumption, we really didn't know much. Unfortunately, this approach left us with a very fragmented and inconsistent approach to EV charging. So some sites had them, some sites didn't, different equipment on different networks. So from a standardization perspective, it was really inconsistent for our customers that were showing up to our shopping centers, and they were getting very different experiences from one site to another. So back in 2017, after spending about 5 years with the company, but within our property tax group, I transitioned to national operations. And one of the first projects I began to work on was an application under the Electric Vehicle Chargers Ontario program that looked at getting funding towards the deployment of EV fast chargers at that time. So we ended up partnering with FLO on an application. We thought that we had a great application that would be appealing to the province, obviously with many of our shopping centers being along highway routes, as well as having amenities for the end user, the charger to use. So, washrooms, food courts, things like that to use while their car was getting charged. Unfortunately, we were unsuccessful in that process, but we did keep the conversation with FLO alive. We even came out to Shawinigan and toured the factory, and had a chance to fly out to California as well and tour some other EV charging providers as well. Ultimately partnered with FLO back in 2017, and our initial deployment and our initial national program was for 15 sites, and at that time 45 chargers. In many cases, those were level 3 fast chargers. They were the first to market in some of the communities that we operate in, and that was something we were really proud about, that those were in most cases the first level 3 fast charger in those local communities. Since 2017, we've really continued to expand on the program with FLO, as well as with Tesla, and today we have close to 350 chargers across our portfolio, many of them predominantly being fast chargers. So whether it's a universal level 3 charger or a Tesla supercharger, of our 350 chargers, the vast majority of them are actually fast chargers. We've had about 500,000 charge sessions at our sites to date. And by having a national program, it's allowed us to have one consistent partner and experience for our customers across the different shopping centers and office building. FLO also provides us with a 24/7 bilingual call center for support for our direct customers. So we've been quite happy with that as well. Strategically, working with FLO, we better understood the market. It became clear that we needed to deploy a pay-for-use model, and understanding that that was going to drive better adoption of our existing infrastructure. So, for example, a TD Center here in Toronto in the past, we had 5 chargers that were often being used at 100%. So there was the thought that we needed to expand and invest additional money for additional chargers, when in reality there was just abuse of those existing chargers where they were in prime locations close to the elevators. People would show up not needing a charge at all, probably showing up with 80-90% battery, but it was free electricity and a prime parking spot for them to use. So it was working with FLO and understanding what would be the best for us. We went for a pay-for-use model, and we learned that simply charging even $1 an hour to use that charger would deter those people from using up those spots. And clearly we've seen in the data that that's true, and we've gotten much better use out of the chargers since then. The final piece I'll comment on with our agreement with FLO that we like and has obviously been a big success for us is really that FLO is responsible for maintaining the equipment, covering the electricity costs, dealing with the end user from a troubleshooting or billing perspective. So really moving in that direction and taking the worry off of our backs, that was another key consideration when we were looking at what type of deployment we wanted to do nationally.
Thank you, Carey. It's interesting how technology incentivizes behavior, or at least modifies behavior. Thank you for this. Dan, how about from you on the utility side?
Yeah, thanks, Amina. And 1 million charge sessions. That's amazing, Carey. That's pretty cool to hear. Our numbers are not that high, but I can't wait until we get there. So an overall theme. Soon. Well, yeah, that's a relative term, isn't it? The theme of about what I'm going to talk about today, it really centers around EV adoption, and what I mean by that is breaking down barriers to encourage EV adoption. That's really the utilities role, or what we see our role as, and that guides the why behind the what of what we're doing. So in terms of ownership, at this point, we're focused on those level 3 fast chargers. We currently have 24 charging stations throughout our electric service territory at 17 different locations in 15 communities. And we'll be expanding that to 40 stations by the end of 2021, which is a pretty high percentage in terms of the number of people in our communities. So some of the deployment decisions that we've made are really based on this unique role that we see the utility playing in this space, and that is to fill some of those gaps that are perhaps not as lucrative or enough to encourage private partners to invest in that space. And what I mean by that is we're trying to connect a network of EV chargers all along our service territory so that no driver is ever too far away from the next fast charger. And again, this means including some remote communities where some private money may not be invested simply because it's seen as too much of a loss. In terms of procurement decisions, the previous point leads to our mentality on this, and that's reliability above all else. And again, I'll reference that remote location where if a driver's out there, I back up. It's one thing if you're at a charger in a big city, that charger is down, you probably only have to go a few blocks to find the next charger. It's not a big deal. But if you're in a remote location where there's only one fast charger, the next one's over an hour away, depending on how much charge you have left in your vehicle, that may be a really big deal. So that's what we're trying to focus on is getting the bar in terms of reliability up across the board, not just in the major centers. So I'll put aside L3s for a second and talk about level 2 chargers. We are very supportive, even if we're not owning those right now, we're very supportive of adoption in that space. And one of the ways we're supporting that is through the Clean BC program. And for those of you unfamiliar with that, it's the government of BC has earmarked a bunch of money to give out as rebates for level 2 chargers at single family homes, multi-unit residential buildings, and workplaces. And the electric utilities, so BC Hydro in their territory and Fortis BC in our territory, are in charge of administering those rebates. We're also involved in the fleet space. We are helping, whether it's municipalities, school districts, health authorities, those are some of the early adopters, but really it's open to everybody. We're helping them apply for government grants and then also following up with supplying some of the capital to make up the difference between what the government grants supply and what's left to pay. And again, that comes back to that breaking down barriers. If we have a potential fleet participant that their biggest barrier is just they don't have the approval or the upfront capital to spend on something like this, we are wanting to step in and help them with that with some money that can be slowly repaid through their rates over the next 10 years or what have you. And that's it for me.
Thank you, Dan. Hazel, can you tell us a bit more about BOMA Canada's role in evaluating, the kind of the deployments that Carey and Dan mentioned from an association perspective? What role does BOMA like to play in furthering EV adoption in cooperation with utilities or commercial real estate vendors like CF, for example?
Yeah, thank you, Amina. So with the help of our industry stakeholders, BOMA Canada is basically trying to set the standard for best practices for building managers to follow in order to mitigate their environmental impact and create positive change. And so how occupants get to and from a building is a very important component of calculating that overall impact. And so through the use of the BOMA Best Assessment, we promote transportation strategies that remove people from their cars. So for example, through public transportation or through active transportation like cycling, but we also promote electrification of transportation through the use of electric cars. And so that's specifically recognized with a question on electric vehicle charging stations. And so in the assessment, there is a question that if you have a level 2 electric charging station in the parking lot or in the facility with appropriate signage, then you'll be able to receive 4 points if you're able to demonstrate this. And so, before we even include a strategy like this, and even, the addition of the level 2 was in consultation with industry stakeholders, we have to make sure that we understand the landscape of a given technology and its impact on the environmental performance of the building by engaging with our industry stakeholders who know about this technology. So for example, like Carey and like Dan and like FLO. And so, we really want to understand the nuances of the potential impacts of a given sustainability strategy, specifically how it applies to an assessment framework. So for example, is it accessible to everyone across the country, or a national standard? We want to make sure that the given technology is just as available regardless of where you are. Should expectations be different depending on a particular asset class? We certify office buildings, light industrial, open air retail, enclosed shopping center, hospitals, you name it. We certify them. And so then what are the considerations? And so is the way that our question is framed allow the opportunity for anybody to be able to benefit from that technology and from that strategy? And then is it financially viable for the average building owner and manager? We don't want to limit somebody's ability to get on that pathway to success through, with the recommendation of certain technologies that might not be available financially. But then also, at the end of the day, does it drive real measurable environmental performance improvements? And so that's, at the end of the day, that's what everything hangs on. So we really depend on our stakeholders to share their knowledge and their insights so that we can make sure that our questions are meaningful. And then we decide what's appropriate and what format it should take, and that becomes part of the assessment. And so the very act of going through the BOMA Best Assessment is just as much an education experience as it is a certification pathway, because the very act of reading the different options and the different recommended strategies through the different areas and categories that we assess, indoor air, energy, water, site, that becomes a recommendation, a tip, a hint towards what else the building manager might be able to do that perhaps they haven't considered before. Perhaps this is an area they're not very familiar with, so they haven't stopped to, they haven't had the opportunity to really explore what else is available. So having sort of this list out what those recommendations could be, I think really helps to just get those, those juices flowing, those ideas going about what could potentially be available to them. And so, for example, installing electric vehicle charging stations is obviously one of those great examples that as we finesse the question, as it evolves, and as our assessment evolves over time, then we're also helping to usher in, new ways of new models and new consumers, perhaps new people who might be interested in adopting these technologies on their sites and see the value and the benefits of them.
So it's an ongoing dialogue with your members, right? You provide them with this initial list, this pre-filtered list, and you guys feed off each other, and hence the importance of data, and we'll get to that eventually. Thank you. A common conversation we have with our clients at FLO is with regards to right sizing and future-proofing a charging deployment. Dan, do you safeguard your procurement process so that the technology you install today is still capable of servicing the needs of EV drivers in 3 years? What sort of hardware and software considerations factor into those conversations from your end, from CF's end?
Yeah, I love how multi-layered these questions are. Can I just say yes and be done? No, this is of course
moving on. No,
that's what everyone came to hear, right? This is of course it's a pretty complicated question, and I say that because in one sense, right sizing and future proofing can sometimes be contradictory. So again, I'll take it from the perspective of the level 3 fast charger to start. There are a number of different levels of fast chargers available in the market right now. You can have 50 kilowatt, 100, 150, 350. The technology is advancing rapidly. However, only a very small percentage of vehicles are capable of charging at the faster end of that spectrum. So this would lead one to believe that a not quite as fast, let's say a 50 or 100 kilowatt charger, is the right size for right now. However, when you compare that to future proofing, you might say that, well, no, we know that vehicles are also improving rapidly. We should put in the 350s so that a few years down the road, or however long it takes, it's able to handle them. it does make it a bit tricky in that sense. So luckily, some vendors are coming up with solutions. I believe FLO is one of them, where you can swap out parts of these fast charging stations to upgrade them at a later date to a faster speed. So I think this is one of the keys to future-proofing, and making sure it's upgradable or adaptable, making sure that you're not so niche with any of your products or your vendors or your technology that you're stuck holding the bag at some later date. And along with that, some other basic considerations in terms of future proofing include the footprint or the form factor of the charging station that you're putting in. You want to make sure that, again, if you need to switch technologies, it fits in the actual space that you've created. Communication protocols, so OCPP is a big one that's out there right now. Make sure, again, that you're not stuck with one vendor or their communication protocol, that it's something that's open to multiple vendors playing in that market. And then upgrades as well, like I say, whether you need to change the speed or some other sort of upgrading you need to add. Switching gears for a second to L2 chargers more specifically, the speed of these chargers is less of an issue, and by that I mean whereas the L3s are rapidly increasing, like I say, 50, 100, 350. Due to the voltage and amperage available at most buildings, you're most likely going to be in the 7 to 9 kilowatt range for the foreseeable future. There are different solutions out there, but it seems like that's more of a given, which is good. It means there's less risk on the right sizing side of things, although then you could argue that, well, how many stations should I put at a single location? That's a whole other question of right sizing. It gets into the same thing, do you build for now versus later? But I would say the same principles hold in terms of future proofing, where you have just make sure that you're adaptable for footprint, software, networking, those other sorts of considerations.
Thank you. The fear of stranded assets, along with range anxiety, I think we can start a dictionary of EV drivers' neurosis.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Dan. Carey, do you factor in future proofing when considering a charging solutions provider?
Sure. So in short, yes, like we certainly considered future proofing when we did our deployments. So when deploying with FLO, we made sure that the infrastructure they were investing in and putting in place could support up to twice the size of our initial deployment. So we didn't want to have to rip up our parking lots again a second go around here as adoption took place. So we went live initially with 1 level 3 fast charger and 2 level 2s per site, but each of those deployments could support up to twice that size. With our Tesla deployments, nearly all of our sites are 20 bay supercharging sites. So these are massive deployments, with most of them being the only supercharging site in the surrounding area. So those two are pretty future-proofed and were built out to support both current and future demand as well. With that said, I also think it's important to note our approach was really intended here to get our feet wet in this space while providing a great amenity to our customers, and I think we've done that successfully. But going forward, I really don't see a need for the landlords to be offering, for instance, EV charging for each parking space in our parking lots. We certainly don't see that today with gasoline. So obviously we're not going to be expected to be providing fuel to cars in every one of the parking spots that they take place, but that they have at an office building or a shopping center. I think as the transition to electric vehicles continues to take place in the market, I see there being less of a need for each one of these stalls to be equipped. As cars go longer and longer in range, people charge at home, there's certainly be less of a need for us to offer this amenity on such a large scale. I also see a repurposing of the existing infrastructure that's in place, especially with gas stations that already have the real estate in the prime locations today. So I think that transition is starting to maybe take place, but obviously we're not there just yet. So I think we're helping to play a role in that right now in a lot of our communities. But I do see that likely probably decreasing in terms of the expectation of the landlord to provide that type of amenity going forward.
Thank you. Thank you. Once it's going to be settled in everybody's habits, right? We're going to develop less of a fear. Thank you. Hazel, how does BOMA Canada consider these same sorts of issues when developing sustainability initiatives for existing or potential members? As an influential organization in the commercial real estate space, how important is it to you that vendors like Cadillac Fairview future-proof their charging deployments?
So from the industry perspective, or from the industry association perspective, I should say, it's a challenge trying to create an assessment or a standard that suits every single building. Like that's not going to happen. There's going to be so many nuances and particularities that we have to keep in mind. So we try not to be prescriptive in our solutions, but rather we want to leave that flexibility for any unique circumstances that might arise. And so basically at the end of the day, we want the given strategy to be meaningful to the building manager and owner in order to deliver that real measurable change and benefits, or a particular strategy won't be adopted if it doesn't meet that criteria. Like the last thing we want to do is encourage solutions that won't fit that given organization's objectives. So on the topic of electric vehicle charging stations or infrastructure, we know one size definitely does not fit all. The size of the building, the number of occupants, the type of occupants, the location of the building itself, is it in a rural or urban area? What particular city is it in? What are the rental rates in that particular city? All of that's going to have an impact on how many stations a building might need and what best technological solution will help meet occupants' needs. And also, if we want to quickly transition towards low emission transportation options, then it has to be dependable and easy to use by the average user. So, future proofing with specific models that allow, for example, and I love this idea, the interoperability with regional public charging networks, that if that just becomes ubiquitous, then it's, what Carey was describing at the beginning in terms of the challenges, then all of a sudden you have this much more dependable, widely available, ubiquitous infrastructure that exists. So we don't prescribe the functionality of a given system. We're not going to tell you, it has to be able to do this and this and this, because it'll be highly specific. But we are looking at the topic of right sizing. Right now, we basically, if you have one charging station, then that's sufficient to get the points. But we are considering the fact that depending on where you are, that might not be meeting the needs, and that might be, in fact, perhaps creating some frustration by certain clients or occupants, and maybe a discouraging factor, in fact, for electrical vehicle adoption. So we're looking at what are the factors that are important for right sizing the infrastructure. So for example, based on your postal code, and if somebody is in a region that has high rental rates, then it's possible that a particular employee at an office building might live in an apartment, and so therefore doesn't have access to charging infrastructure, and so is dependent on that office building to provide that charging infrastructure. Or certainly that is a massive bonus for them when they consider where they're going to work. And so what we're learning through all these conversations, and as we evolve as well and our standard evolves, we're really happy also, and then I'll make a little plug here, but basically we're really happy to announce that all of this and more is included in our EV charging guide that is now available for download on the BOMA Canada website. And we couldn't obviously have done it without FLO's tremendous work and help in this area. So it really is a fantastic guide in terms of helping identify what exactly future-proofing means and what right-sizing could look like.
Thank you, Hazel. And not to dwell on that plug, I read it and I thought it should be a mandatory read for anybody who's interested in this field, because it's a great overview, rather detailed overview of the main questions you should ask yourself and to identify what's at stake if you decide to deploy, or if you're even interested in purchasing them. Thank you, Hazel. A common misconception surrounding EV charging in commercial spaces is that it's just not commercially viable. I would really like to hear from Carey and Hazel on this, because of course, as a commercially driven enterprise, you have to consider both the environmental and economic benefits of a charging deployment. But can you talk us through some of those benefits and discuss a little more why you think EV charging can be a money maker in the long run?
I'm going to welcome Carey to maybe take the first stab on this one, since you're coming at it from a much more commercial perspective.
Sure. So we definitely feel that there's a commercially viable future for EV charging, but I don't think we're there just yet. I think at this point, it continues to be a great amenity that we can provide to our clients. And it's a differentiator for us in the market, especially with the level 3 fast chargers, but definitely not a revenue generator for us just yet. With that said, as I mentioned earlier, with the smart chargers like the ones we've deployed with FLO that provide us the ability to charge the end user for use, notify the user when their charge is nearing completion, and other things, it really allows us to optimize the existing infrastructure we already have in place. So there's definitely been some savings there from not having to unnecessarily invest in more chargers. Obviously, there's also the indirect benefits of EV chargers. It shows our commitment to sustainability and supporting the communities we operate in. I mentioned earlier that we're at nearly 500,000 charge sessions to date at our site, so I think it's safe to say that we've made a real impact in those communities, and that's something that we're proud about, and we know that will continue to grow. And another key indirect benefit that I wanted to touch on is some of the great marketing opportunities that the chargers have opened us up to. So, in fact, we just launched yesterday, it was announced a partnership with Porsche, where we're offering test drives of their first all-electric vehicle, the Taycan, at 3 of our properties in Ontario and British Columbia. So there's obviously some indirect or direct, marketing benefit to having these chargers on our sites as well.
Yeah, and I guess to add on the environmental component or area, having convenient, reliable charging infrastructure is going to have a positive impact on adoption rates, which means that the overall community itself where these chargers are located will be reducing its carbon footprint. And so that will lead, of course, to improved air quality and therefore improved public health, and as well as a reduction in ecological damage. So a very clear relationship there. And I think to me, one of the aspects that's the most exciting is that building managers and owners are positioned to become, key players in helping the country transition towards a low carbon economy. Building managers have had such a tremendous success at reducing the environmental impacts of their buildings and what's contained within the walls, with of course a lot of effort on landscaping, restoring natural habitats and whatnot. And so this also is one more way to have this very significant impact on, being able to make a difference in the country's transportation future. And I think that's a very exciting place to be.
Thank you both. Dan, I'm sure Fortis BC is no stranger to those imperatives. Do those conversations surrounding economic viability of EV? I mean, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, absolutely. Every capital expenditure and business endeavor that we undertake at the utility has to be approved by the Utilities Commission, which views everything through the lens of what is best for the ratepayer. So in that sense, yes, everything that we do needs to be commercially viable, at least to a degree, so as not to cause an undue pressure on increase in electric rates. That said, there's different ways you can attack that, even if something's less commercially viable for the first few years and it's shown that it will be later on, you can find ways around that or different mechanisms, but that's kind of a separate conversation. But yes, it is definitely top of mind. However, I do want to echo some of the things that Hazel and Carey said in terms of the direct versus indirect benefits. And for sure, we see a lot of value in the indirect benefits here. Substantial ones like GHG reduction, as Hazel was saying. Fortis BC specifically has a 30 by 30 target, we call it, where we're aiming to reduce customers' emissions by 30% by the year 2030, and so EVs play a huge role in that. If you can change gasoline or diesel emissions into EV fueled vehicles, obviously you're making a big impact. But additionally, the business case in terms of an electric utility is fairly simple. You want to sell more electricity, and so there's also the perspective that if deploying one fast charging station or a number of level 2, whatever stations, even if they may not be commercially viable for the first few years, if they go and encourage the adoption of 5 or 10 more electric vehicles, well, those electric vehicles they're all charging somewhere, and that electricity is coming from the utility. So there's definitely that in terms of indirect benefit from purely business perspective. But again, I tend to gravitate more towards the environmental benefit of that. This is the perfect scenario where it's a win-win. You get both of them all at once.
Creating that habit is good for both sides, and I don't think we have to be shy, to admit that. Thank you, Dan. Now, a charging deployment at a commercial site can vary in breadth and scope. Some larger deployments, some smaller, but the larger ones can benefit from power management technologies, which can schedule or throttle charging stations and help site owners avoid peak demand charges. And I'm sure Dan would have some interesting thoughts on this after, with respect to the stress that it may cause on the distribution grid, right? I'd like to hear from both Carey and Dan on this. Do you take advantage of any of these technologies? Have they helped you save on your utility bill?
Sure, I'll go first because I imagine Dan will probably have more to say on this. In all cases where we've deployed EV chargers, we've been fortunate to negotiate that our partner covers the cost of electricity to operate them. So we aren't directly involved in the power management technologies or throttling down of chargers or anything like that. That's their business as the operators. With that said, I can definitely say for myself and our team here within the National Operations Group, this program has definitely got us a lot more educated on things like global adjustment costs here in Ontario, the importance of peak shaving initiatives and battery deployments, and other ways in which we can both reduce costs but also deploy sustainable alternatives that support the environment. So I think EV charging and understanding, especially with a level 3 fast charger, the peak demand impacts when you're talking about feeding a charger like that off of a Class A account here in Ontario. It was a significant educational experience for us, understanding the impacts and further understanding global adjustment and peak demand and things like that.
Thank you, Carey. Dan?
Yes, so you're right. This is a big point of interest from utilities perspective. I'll focus on level 2 chargers at MURBs and workplaces for this one, and specifically I'll start off anyway with the Clean BC program that I mentioned earlier. So just a reminder, Clean BC, provincial government funding towards rebates, level 2 smart rebates for smart network chargers, and that really is the cornerstone of this program, is that these chargers must be smart and networked in order to allow for this demand management that you're talking about. And this is important from a couple of perspectives. On the one side, you have the building perspective, which you've alluded to there. They absolutely want to save on their utility bill. This is going to be very difficult to do if you have these high demand charges that are being created from EVs. Imagine everybody gets home at 5 p.m., plugs in, and all of a sudden your building's demand has gone through the roof. Doesn't only hurt you for the 1 year. If most utilities are like us, I believe, where they have a ratcheted demand clause, and that means that if you have 1 month or 1 day in a month of really high peak demand, you're going to be feeling the pain of that for the next 11 months. Your demand charge is all going to be some percentage of that peak demand. So it is really important to address, and really something that's being focused on in terms of buildings, both residential and commercial space. To flip over to the utility perspective, absolutely, we have a large concern. I mean, EVs are a terrific opportunity, but they're also a big risk in terms of putting a lot of new pressure on the grid. And it's the same thing, people showing up, arriving back home, plugging in. It's the same time that we see our peak grid, or our grid peak demand hitting already that 5 to 7 p.m. mark. What we don't want to have to do is replace a whole ton of infrastructure solely based on that new demand spike. That's going to cost a lot of money for the utility, which gets passed on to the ratepayers. Nobody's happy. So what we're really trying to be proactive about this and how we manage it, and that's kind of the key term. We're taking an approach of being proactive versus reactive. We want to put in place programs that help avoid some of those larger impacts, or at least push them down the road a bit so that they can be spaced out, rather than be reactive, just wait for it to happen and go and replace infrastructure as needed, which, like I said, is going to not be fun for anybody's pocketbook.
Thank you, Dan. Hazel, I'm sure you have thoughts on this. This can't be foreign to you, the importance of peak demand avoidance from a building owner and management perspective.
I mean, no, definitely not. We specifically do address it in the BOMA assessment, and so if there are peak demand strategies in place of the building, then that's recognized specifically because of the tremendous impact that can have on all of a sudden needing perhaps some new infrastructure just to deal with those peaks. So whatever we can do to shave those off and structure the consumption a bit better will be beneficial. So yes, that's absolutely something that we emphasize in the tool as well.
Thank you, Hazel. Data, my favorite topic. With more and more insights and analytic tools being made available from EV charging network operators, I would like to ask, what sort of tools do you use to measure the station uptake and sustainability impact on your charging deployments as a whole? Carey, what kind of tools do you use in regards to your deployment, and what usage and environmental metrics are most important to CF?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, the beauty of the smart chargers really is that there's a lot of reporting that can come directly from, in this case, from FLO. So we get extremely detailed reporting on usage well beyond simply sub-metering a non-smart charger and only knowing the total kilowatt hour, at the end of a year. So having that detailed report available to us at our fingertips has really helped us to understand usage across our sites in a lot better way. It's amazing to see some of the trends. So for instance, at an office building in downtown Vancouver, we've really started to see high usage well beyond the normal operating hours of the office building. And that's helped obviously drive some additional parking revenue for us, considering it's behind a pay-for-use wall of the parking lot. Similarly, here at CF Toronto Eaton Centre in downtown Toronto, we've seen a lot of usage by condo dwellers in the area that want to own an electric vehicle, but may not have access to an EV charger in their condo building. So they come here and they charge in our parkade without necessarily even visiting the shopping center, which of course we hope that they are. But again, it's been a nice added benefit and another way that we're further, supporting the community around us by, I think now, and I knew that this was going to happen directly in conversations with FLO and with Tesla, that it is helping support, the sale of additional electric vehicles, because our chargers are now providing an opportunity for those condo dwellers to buy a car. They can come, and if you're driving around in a local area here and not using a ton of mileage on your car, you can come to charge here once a week or so. We're also using the reporting to help our development team as well and making more strategic decisions in how many chargers do we include in our new construction sites as well. So data and analytics has definitely been key, and one of the key benefits of deploying obviously smart chargers versus a non-smart charger.
Thank you. Dan, I'm sure you have thoughts on this.
You bet. So this is where my inner nerd really shines through. I recently started referring to myself as a professional engineer, but an amateur data analyst, and my wife pointed out that they pay professionals but not amateurs, so I should stick to my day job. Despite that, I do love looking at the numbers and trying to decipher what they mean, both from a historical perspective, but also projecting future trends. Again, it's kind of that proactive versus reactive approach to how we're going to handle this. And I want to first point out, in terms of analytics, Hazel brought up something with the right sizing. That's one place where we've been using this. We're actually using analytics to try to determine at which point, at which number of usage or sessions per day at any given charger does the likelihood of a person waiting in line for that charger occur. So we're using those trend lines rather than just blindly guessing, oh, we think we need another charger, another 2 chargers at this site. We're trying to say once it gets above a certain usage, we know that the likelihood of needing another one to reduce wait times becomes a reality. So little things like that. So I was glad Hazel brought that up. At Fortis, we're lucky enough to have smart meters at almost all of I think all the residential properties, most of the commercial and industrial properties as well. So that makes assessing sustainability impacts pretty easy. We can convert electricity that's delivered to EVs through charging into gasoline avoided, which is easily convertible into GHG reduction. So that's one metric that we're using, so to speak. And I think this is something that can be done on the building side as well with these smart network chargers that we've been talking about. And I encourage all building owners to do that. You can track both your GHG reductions as well as your fuel cost savings. And that's great because then you have a multi-pronged story to tell your building residents. Some of them are going to be more interested in the fuel that they saved or the fuel costs that they saved. Some are going to be just as interested or more in the GHG reductions. And so now you can kind of approach it from both sides. If we back up for a second and look at the bigger picture in BC, we're doing great in terms of EV sales. We have this Zero Emission Vehicle Act, or ZEV Act, which has prescribed new EV sales targets by the years 2025, 2030, 2040. We're supposed to be at 100% new car sales will be EVs by 2040. And we're actually ahead of schedule. We're above where we're supposed to be at 2025, which is terrific. And it's an opportunity for buildings to capitalize on that interest in EVs and that wave and positioning yourself as having this competitive advantage. It's also a challenge, as we've been talking about, both from the building demand side, but the utility side puts this extra pressure on the grid. So one place where we're really using analytics is to try to identify the clusters of where these EVs are showing up first. And those, instead of, again, we know there's say 1,000 EVs in our territory. Well, great, but what does that mean? If the majority of them are located in one neighborhood, we know that we're going to have to address the grid infrastructure in that neighborhood. well before any other place. So it's analytics are really enabling us to approach this in a much more strategic way than we would be without them. And then once we have developed determined where those neighborhoods are, we can develop programs to help manage that, whether it's demand response or time of use. I'll pause there. As you can tell, I could probably go on talking about this for a while. I know that we're going to have some time for concluding remarks. Are those supposed to be built into this section, or are we going to wait on those, Amina?
A little bit of both. A little bit of both. Hazel, what are your thoughts on what Dan just shared with us? What I'm taking from Dan's statement is it allows us to be proactive in our deployments. You know, it allows us to think things forward. How about you? How about BOMA?
I mean, so yeah, so the importance of data really can't be underemphasized, or it can't be overstated for BOMA Canada, but also for the entire industry. So every single year we take a snapshot of the performance of buildings in the BOMA Best Assessment. So we look at how buildings perform during that particular year. We look at energy trends, water trends, you know, the adoption of certain technologies, management programs, you know, figure out what it is that truly exceptional buildings are doing, so that those who are just on the beginning of the sustainability journey can, you know what to start, what are the pieces they should start putting in place. So the topic of EV data, you know, we don't specifically look at the data that, you know, Cadillac Fairview has, though we would love to. And I guess this is sort of, you know, what would be amazing to see, because, you know.
Did you get the hint, Carey?
And really everybody's data, because I think the power of the data is this aggregation. And so being able to create this much larger landscape, you know, a better idea of what the landscape looks like. So knowing that smart infrastructure is able to provide so many of these metrics, you know, how much carbon was avoided, how many users visited the site, for how long. All of a sudden you get a much better idea of what the current landscape looks like. And then you can now start determining, you know, what future programs should be in place, well, how certain building managers and owners should be, what trends they should be following, you know, what the government can do to further support. But so on top of all that data and those metrics, I think what's also really important, and you know, we're being able to share those today, is also the stories. And I think it's those success stories to build up that capacity, build up the understanding of what's working, what's not, what are the challenges. You know, Carey, your story, you know, when you laid it out at the beginning, you know, how, you know, the path that you were on, and then sort of what corrections you made. I think that's absolutely critical, because that's how we're going to be able to learn from each other, and hopefully someone will be able to avoid those pains and have a smoother transition. And it'll also help demystify the technology and make it more approachable. And so, you know, we really hope that the BOMA Canada EV charging guide can also help ease property owners into this decision. And so, of course, as we increase how many vehicle charging stations we have in communities, that will alleviate the range anxiety, and, you know, we'll just continue ushering this transformation. And so, yeah, I think that the combination of the metrics that, you know, that Dan was describing and the success stories means that as an industry, we can now crunch those numbers. And so if we were able to have a look across all building managers and owners as much as possible, and then all different providers, you know, what does that look like? And then now we can really start seeing, you know, what the future of electric vehicle use in Canada is going to look like, and how we can support it, you know, make modifications along the way to really fine tune that path to success.
Thank you. Thank you. We are done, I think, with what we had prepared for you guys, but we have a few questions. Panelists, are you up for the task? May I bombard you? We'll start with one, and we'll see if we can take more. So the first one targets the future-proofing conversation. So is additional capacity future-proofing simply raw kilowatt available, or are you talking more about load management for future installations? Arie, are you taking it?
Yeah, is that more for me?
I guess for whoever is brave.
Go ahead, Carey, and I can go after if you want.
Dan probably has a better understanding of the actual kilowatt hours and the kilowatt, you know, how much it's from us. It's future proofing is just simply more about the number of chargers. As I mentioned, in most cases, we've been able to fortunately structure our deals where you know, the cost of electricity is borne by the operator. I will mention, you know, one of the barriers is, especially when we talk about the level 3 fast chargers, which have such a high peak demand. it is complicated in scenarios where, you know, those are connecting into our buildings and our existing electricity accounts. So again, that was something, another hurdle that we had to understand certainly a lot better before we entered into these agreements, especially when you're talking about deploying something like a 20-bay Tesla supercharging site, which are the equivalent of all 20 level 3. The cost of those chargers running on our accounts at the wrong time is extreme. So that, again, from future proofing for us, we're talking just straight number of chargers that would be needed at our sites.
Thank you, Carey. Dan?
Yeah. I mean, when you're talking future proofing again, it can mean a number of different things. So is it simply raw kilowatt available? No, I mean, that is one big piece of it for sure. And again, like Carey just pointed out, it depends on if you're talking about L3s or L2s. I mean, it applies to both, but there are differences between them. I'll tackle this question, I think the one after it as well, because it's asking what infrastructure upgrades are needed. Again, it's a mixed bag. We've seen, I'll talk about, you know, let's say MURBs right now. Some MURBs have enough raw capacity that they don't need an upgrade to their main line or to most of their infrastructure. And the beauty of EV charging is that in the best case scenario, it's happening, you know, if you can shift it to the middle of the night, a lot of buildings have very low demand during that time anyway. So perfect case scenario, no, you don't need to upgrade any of your infrastructure. Now that's probably a bit rosier than most pictures are, but there's, I would say, perhaps less infrastructure upgrade that's needed if EV charging is managed appropriately than some people fear. So yes, it's important to look at the big picture right from the get-go, and actually Clean BC, might as well answer that question too. The Clean BC program I've been talking about applies to residential, both single family home and MURBs, as well as workplace, not public charging. This is employees at workplaces, but the main point there is that they've come out with a new tweak to that, and it's called the EV Ready Plan, where there's additional funding available for MURBs to look at what it would take to get your building 100% EV ready. And that doesn't mean necessarily have chargers in every stall, but it means infrastructure that they would need, whether that's upgrades, etc., to be able to supply EV charging to all of its residents. So again, it's just looking at this ahead of time, and I can't say there's one, you know, silver bullet answer. This is what you need to upgrade. This is what you don't. But at least start looking at it now. And like I said, there's a chance that it's less than you're worried it might be.
Thank you, Dan. We have a lot of questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to tackle them all. What I can tell you though is that a lot of those answers, I think, or thoughts that could help you, you will find in the BOMA EV guide that you will receive via email, hopefully today, if not tomorrow. So I'm hoping that you'll be able to find some answers. If not, you can certainly contact our panelists directly, and they'll take it from there. So it looks as though we're running out of time. I'd like to once again thank both our panelists and our audience for joining us today for this discussion. And I'd like to remind you all that this is just one of a series of conversations we're hosting on EV charging. Our next webinar, hosted in conjunction with Electric Autonomy Canada, entitled EV Charging Quality of Service, Improving the Driver Experience. It will take place on November 19th. Stay tuned to our social media channels or join our mailing list to stay up to date with the latest from FLO. And thanks again to our panelists, thanks to our partner BOMA Canada, and to our audience. Thank you for such a turnout. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.